welcome to Windows on the World live. It's Sunday night, 9 p.m. WindowsOnTheWorld.net, Spreaker, Ocelli.com, FreemanJack.net, Fab Radio, a couple of others. Mike might remember them, but sorry to say, I need to make a list. Right, I know you didn't have a great start to the week, Mark. I'm hoping it got better for you, so take it away.
Afraid I find it of no value whatsoever. Sorry, Tony, I'm getting a bit of feedback there. Don't know why that is.
I'm sorry, Mark. Right, you're going to have to start again. I don't know whether you've got any feedback there, but we had actually no vocals going out up until right this point. I'm really sorry about that. There's been a bit of an issue.
Oh, okay. So do I start all over again?
Yeah, start again. Sorry about that. Welcome to the show, everyone. Mark's been talking, and unfortunately, the producers let him down.
Okay, Tony, right. Well, thanks for that admission. I thought there was an audience out there, Tony. It was my audience of one. Me. All right, then. Well, yes, last week we did a show, and it featured what was going on in London, Agenda 21, and all that sort of stuff we talk about. But really, the local picture, regeneration, and all of the re-engineering of society that's going on, all of the things we're seeing around us. And of course, the show featured councillors and people like Gordon Peters, who've interrupted the Haringey development vehicle. in Haringey, which basically has stopped this huge takeover by Lend-Lease with a partnership with the council of basically people who are going to be, as far as the public are concerned, unelected. And it's all been stopped. And this Claire Kober, who was the CEO of Haringey, has resigned. And she, of course, said it was all about being abused and harassed, and it's all sexist. And no, it's not really, nothing like that if you actually listen to the show from last week. But I did send this show to councillor and cabinet member for the environment, Clyde Lokes. This is the councillor for and cabinet member for the environment for Waltham Forest, and he actually sent me an email back. I think I'll go straight into what it says. He says, I said it to him actually, and Claire Coghill, who's the leader of Waltham Forest Council, and Martin Eason, and he's the deputy leader. And neither of those two got back to me, but Mr. Lokes got back to me very quickly. And I said in the email, I said, "Dear Clyde, please listen to this important information and respond accordingly. You seriously need to respond to the public you serve." The show was called London's Dystopia, the public winning fight back. And this is his response. "Hello, Mark. Thank you for your email and for taking the time to contact me. However, as I don't subscribe to the hugely discredited and laughable conspiracy theories that suggest there is an Agenda 21 takeover of the world, I'm afraid I find it of no value whatsoever. Yours, Clyde." Now, in that show, there was no real mention of a world takeover of Agenda 21 or indeed any conspiracy theories whatsoever. Nope. So now we have some great quotes for Mr. Lokes that he actually states that public officials and people of experience and indeed great knowledge are laughable, conspiracy theorists, and of no value. So for the 10th year running, Clyde Lokes from Waltham Forest wins the completely useless stroke useful idiot of the year. Sorry, I'll correct that. The most useless stroke useful, highly paid idiots of the year. So there you go. That was an interesting start to the show. And I'll just tell you what I said to him in response to his nonsense that he sent back, his huge own goal. I said, "Councillor Lokes, you clearly wish to ignore the public meeting held last week at the Epicentre in Leytonstone, whose speakers are featured in the show. Your patronising and uninformed response clearly shows you have not listened to or considered the information presented on behalf of the constituents in your borough. Which part of the factual information in the show is a conspiracy theory? The people featured in the show are council officials, including those who have stopped the corporate takeover in Haringey, and by dismissing the content, you are openly acting against the public interest. The truth about Claire Kober is conveniently a conspiracy theory for those with their noses in the corporate trough. The facts about her resignation are clearly presented in this show by those who stopped the HDV, including Gordon Peters. The show is actually about what is happening in the borough of which you are a big part and getting paid very well for." And it carries on. So I said, "I had this conspiracy theory nonsense from lobbyists in Waltham Forest. They now know that this is the policy of local authorities and a national and global issue." Excuse me a moment. We're having a few technical problems here tonight, Tony. Yeah. I've got something going on in the background, which I'll just get rid of. Yes, but apart from that, everything's going quite well, isn't it, I think?
Yeah. But, it'll be better next week. It'll be polished and shiny.
It'll all be polished and shiny, but we don't want it too polished and shiny, do we, Tony? Because we've got some very nice little insertions, and not many of the public know what you look like, really, but they're going to find out, you see, because you're the producer of the show, and we've got to see you at home relaxed. However, I'll carry on with this, right? So it says, "I have this conspiracy theory nonsense from lobbyists in Waltham Forest. They now know that this is the policy of local authorities and a national and global issue. The fact that the PR-led and journalist-free media do not report it cannot undermine the factual and well-referenced information. As you must be aware, Agenda 21 or 2030 now is a global action plan implemented at a local level. You yourself stated that this is not just happening in this country, but all over Europe, so you know that it's part of a bigger picture. Are you you saying that the 40 chapters of Agenda 21 are a conspiracy theory? I challenge you to find any deficiency in the information I have presented. I also challenge you to a public debate in front of the public in your borough who you state that you represent. Your patronising response is an insult to the quality of information contained in the show. Yours sincerely, Mark Windows. Now, funnily enough, Tony, and I can't understand this, he didn't respond at all.
Well, your response was a first-class response, and maybe you should get some lessons in response from Mark Windows. £100 an hour, are you?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm cheaper than Common Purpose or any of the change agent groups. So I know he's been trained by Common Purpose, and that cost a fair few grand. So what these people are very skilled at is arrogance and giving you a quick response and trying to be flippant. But when we're talking about facts, it doesn't really work, because he's not in possession of any of the facts. He believes in man-made climate change, or he says he does, to fill his pockets. Because the agenda of Mini Holland in Waltham Forest, which was implemented in Enfield and also into Kingston, is all about getting everybody out of their cars, trapped in an open concentration camp in very, very high density area. But he lives in a nice house in Leytonstone. So the constituents of that borough, who he claims to represent, should go knocking on his door. You can find it on the internet. You can find out where he lives. Or just email him. Even better, fill his inbox with emails and put him right on a few things. I think we might be able to bring him round. He might have to go to retraining, though. But we all remember 1984, don't we? He could be the new Winston, and we could bring him in to a bit of actual fact.
Yeah.
I think that would be a great step forward.
Yeah, for good training, we can recommend windowsontheworld.net, where you can find the archives there, and that will train you right up in all the things you need to know.
Well, exactly. And he's probably heard of my shows, you see, because he's been looking at them or been past them by people and gone, oh, look at this conspiracy theorist. Well, it's not a conspiracy theory now, is it? Because it's happened. I got out of Waltham Forest while I could. If I still had my vehicles there, it's very doubtful I could even find my way out. However, we're going to talk about some really interesting stuff tonight. I'm talking about local officials. What about genetic modification of the human race? And where better to start than with council officials? The assumptions the custodians have, the right to rule over us, etc. And we have covered this a little bit, but we're going to have a very interesting guest on tonight called Sherry Swiney, who's a good friend and associate of another guest that we had on recently, a fellow called Jerry Marzinski. And Jerry was a very interesting guest. People should go back and listen to the show we did with Jerry, which was called Demonic Possession, Are Demons Real? And we discussed in that show whether demonic entities were attached to people with paranoid schizophrenia. And we're going to talk about that general subject tonight in the respect of this so-called negative energy. And we're going to go into some interesting areas, because this takes us into this genetic modification of the human race. Why are we so compliant? It takes us into the energy field, what that really is, because the etheric energy field was rather discredited in this century, but in the previous century it was accepted science that there was an etheric field. And scientists allegedly now, the ones that can actually raise their heads above the parapet, are now saying that yes, this field does exist. And this, my interpretation of this, is that there is a field behind everything, and that state of awareness, which is just awareness, it's neither good or bad, it just is. It's there all the time. And of course we've had these, I don't want to bore you with all the all the statements on this sort of stuff that's been handed down by all these gurus over the last few thousand years, but it kind of fits in with science in a way. Because I've experienced a lot of this paranormal stuff, and I've studied it actually in quite a lot of depth, and had a lot of out-of-body experiences, and experienced this field and actually experimented with it, then I find this a very good place to start. But we're going to get Sherry on very soon, and I'm just going to take a little quote from her to take us into what we're going to be talking about. This is from Sherry's website, Keyhole Journey, and we're going to go into that a bit later, and we'll get all the references and people can have a look at what Sherry does. However, this is interesting because it's about this intrusion by negative entities. And Sherry experienced this and found a way to deal with it. And it's very fascinating and quite simple and very straightforward. Well, it's very straightforward compared to a lot of the rather, I think, confusing dialogue that goes on around this subject. And this is just a quote. If these thoughts were not coming from me, and I could sit back and watch them flow through me and feel disgusted by them, then they were from an outside source. Researching this, I learned about the Archons of ancient times. And then we go into the 1947 texts of the Nag Hammadi found in Egypt. Well, they're not from 1947, they were found in 1947 in Nag Hammadi. There's a story of what the Nag Hammadi people, which were a group of probably Essenes, we don't actually know who these people were, and also the texts are very, very varied. They came from many different sources. They include biblical texts, but they also include a lot of texts that have not been seen before. Some of the texts were duplicated. These were written in Aramaic and Greek, and they talk about the Archons. Now, a lot of people go on about these Archon, the entities, or this intrusion by this energy. And what's very interesting about these Nag Hammadi scriptures is that they do refer to this outside force. And there is a general pattern throughout the Nag Hammadi scriptures that these people are trying to purify themselves to keep something out, which I found very fascinating, because if you think about it, looking around you now, we are absolutely bombarded with negativity. It's a wonder, really, how we can actually see through it. But the way we do see through it is to break the program of it, which is coming a lot through the media and the belief system that we're pushed into. It says here, the Archons were associated with the 7 visible planets and perceived as agents of the demiurge, predatory beings who inhabit spiritual awakening by convincing humanity of a false reality, forces of sin and temptation. They influence the way you perceive the world, not the world itself. Goes back to what we were saying. The primary power in the world we inhabit is the indwelling divinity of the planet, the Gaian intelligence. It was called Sophia by the Gnostics. Sophia Pistis is actually what it's referred to in the Nag Hammadi scriptures. If you are aligned to the Gaian intelligence, you do not see the world as a place of fear and predation, but of beauty, bounty and magic. This confirmed that I was not losing my mind, but instead being attacked by negative parasitic spirit beings that are very real. Now, this is interesting because we don't actually go into this that much. But I think tonight we can actually have a good discussion with Sherry all about this. Sorry, Ton, my phone just went off there. I thought I'd switched it off. But I'm just going to go into Sherry's That's a Lie program, which I'm going to talk about later on. Sherry states that the That's a Lie program worked perfectly on eliminating the brainwashing conditioning, allowing me the mental space I required to become who I wanted to be instead of mindlessly being what others programmed into me. My theory had worked. Once I broke through and conquered the brainwashing effects, I was surprised to find that much of what had been forcefully programmed into my brain as a child, was still being utilized by the spirit parasites against me. Now, we brought this up with Jerry. In other words, these entities actually know everything about you. They seem to have access to every single memory that you've got and use it against you. And I would urge people to listen to that show because it's absolutely fascinating, with Jerry Marzinski, the psychiatric practitioner who worked with people with paranoid schizophrenia who were very, very disturbed. And he stated that some of these people definitely had demonic forces attached to them. It carries on. I was still receiving negative thoughts and messages which sounded exactly like my own thoughts. The prodding and poking, the suggestions, even demands coming from them were beyond anything I could imagine thinking, much less doing. Now, let's go into the bigger picture before we bring on Sherry. The bigger story behind all this is that of the Watchers and the Nephilim, who inbred with the daughters of men. Now, The reason this is important is because in these biblical texts and these legends, and we're going to go into the Nag Hammadi as well, we're talking about the Old Testament here, and the book of Enoch, which is in the Ethiopian Bible, but it's not in the Old Testament according to the Roman Church, or even the Church of England. So basically, or the Universal Church as they are known, really, because the Catholic Church and the Church of England are under the Universal Church, which is all Rome, really. So it's interesting that this book of Enoch was left out, and the book of Enoch actually describes how Enoch was made a magistrate to deal with these entities that the watchers, the Nephilim, had put onto the earth, these evil watchers who came down, who were actually the gods or the offspring of the gods, and they came down and they bred with the daughters of men, and they created these giants. And this is the description of where these really demonic entities were unleashed in the world. Now, I think a lot of these entities are minor demonic entities, the ones that attack us or the ones that disrupt the energy field. However, I do think that there are some really, really malevolent ones still left, and that ties in with this Watcher story. People can go, yeah, it's all speculation. Of course it's all speculation, but in the world of parapsychology, what we're trying to do is bring this down into some kind of scientific model. And of course it has to be theoretical, but let's put it this way. Most of the science that we hear now is theoretical. So we're trying to prove something here through theories, and we're going to ask, well, does it actually make sense? And this stuff does make sense. And there is evidence that self-appointed elites believe that they are an offspring of the Nephilim, and therefore have the blood of humans mixed with the blood of the gods. Now, this is not divine as in godly, because according to legend and many ancient texts, the Nephilim giants who came to earth went against divine and natural law and were allegedly involved in cannibalism. It's believed they unleashed these demonic entities, which were very powerful, in effect demons which wreaked havoc for thousands of years ago, and whose demonic presence is still here and also used by those who wish to control the genetically modified and dumbed down modern humans. And we've talked about useful idiots at the beginning of the show. So the useful idiots are merely the shepherds appointed for the flock by people who know better. Now, in other worlds, those who benefit from the Darwinian control order, the enforced through scientific education programming, namely the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favoured races in the struggle for life. Now, that was actually the title of the origin of species. I'll just say that again because we brought it up in a previous show and we're dealing with this. The original name for the origin of species was the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favoured races in the struggle for life. Now, this, in my opinion, is a mass brainwashing exercise which is still supported by its millions of victims, us. So this accords with the belief of a bloodline linked to the gods with superior DNA. These were the disgraced fallen angels, but once men of renown, the giants of the Old Testament, and it's strange how they described us in the Old Testament and in totally the opposite way in the book of Enoch. He's chosen by the angels to bring news from above about the eternal damnation of the Nephilim. And another idea that's used against the public, and we're going to go into this now, is what we're talking about, those who are appointed. And it goes into this Archon, the Archon energy, which just means a high official, a ruler, or actually it was referred to as one of the 9 principal magistrates of ancient Athens. This is the Greek, obviously. It was from a Greek root, an authoritative figure or leader, and it means leader or ruler from the Greek archos. It's derived from arch, meaning beginning, origin, or first place. So that's an interesting interpretation as well. In other words, the gods would be from the first place, and the Nephilim were the product of the gods, and then they inbred with the daughters of men and created these the Watchers created the Nephilim, and the Nephilim became the Rephaim, who were actually ruling Palestine for a very, very long time. If you look in the Bible, though, the Rephaim were these warriors who were allegedly the offspring of the Nephilim. So it could be interpreted that the Archons or Watchers, the Nephilim or Rephaim, were from the first place, meaning from the gods. Now, that's an interesting way to start the show. And I think we should bring in Sherry, actually, because there's a lot more I want to go into with this, but I don't want to get it to be too dry. So, Sherry, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Sherry. Yeah, we had a few technical hitches there, and I think we're right into the show now. So just tell us a little bit about how you got into this subject, because we talked about it in quite a lot of depth last night, and we went into different areas which I want to bring up. So can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, and we can expand on that throughout the show?
Okay. Yeah, I got into this because I had gone through some horrific abuse as a child. And in that process, I was pretty much brainwashed, although I didn't know it at the time. And so I got to a point in my young life, in my young woman life, where I was watching myself having reactions to things that, they didn't make sense. And I began to wonder what was going on. I wasn't hearing voices, but I was having kind of automatic reactions, and it wasn't my intention to do that. So I wondered if I was just overreacting. I mean, they say women always overreact, right? That's the thing. Well, that didn't seem to be right. Why would I overreact when someone says something simple and I go off the wall with it? So I began looking at myself and wondering what was going on, and I began watching my thoughts and realizing that these thoughts really weren't anything that I was thinking. They didn't resemble what I was really thinking, and I became curious as to what was going on with me. I didn't understand. So I got to the point where I started researching, and my first step was to research the brain, research all of the literature on the brain to see how it works. So I could figure this out. And that was real interesting, but it didn't answer my questions. And, eventually, to make a long story short, because this took many years to go through, I began researching the Bible, and that led me to archaeology, and that led me to quantum physics, and that led me to the esoteric, and I learned then about the etheric energy and the field that's all around us. And since these thoughts were not mine, I was already convinced that they were not mine. I wanted to figure out how to eliminate this. And eventually I was invited to learn computer programming by the company that I was working for at the time. And in that process, I made the connection between how our brains, based on what I had read, are, kind of act like a computer in that they can be programmed. So a computer can be programmed and your brain can be programmed. So I had the idea or the theory that, maybe I could rewrite the code in my brain. But when I started thinking about how to do that, I realized, that's really way too complicated. And when I'm in the midst of hearing or having thoughts that don't belong to me, how do I remember? I needed something simple to remember, because that's one of the biggest challenges is while you're in the midst of this is to remember to do the opposite, or remember to take action rather than following through with the thoughts. So then I came up with the That's a Lie program, that I call it That's a Lie. And it's a very, very simple thing. I realized through all of my other research that when we come into this world, we don't have hatred and fear and anxiety. We don't even know what that is, right? That's
right, yeah.
Okay, so we come in pretty pure. And our brains from the age of 0 to 6 are really in what they call the theta wave state. And that theta wave state is analogous to a hypnotic state, wherein we record what we see around us and what other people are doing, what they're saying. And we take all of that in as the truth because, you know, we don't know any better. So I got to thinking about that. And what I realized is that everything I had ever been taught about who I am and what I'm like and what I'm all about, none of that was true. So I carried that further and started thinking, well, okay, when I hear these thoughts that aren't mine, I'm just going to say that's not true. That's a lie. And that's where that was born. So I continued working that, and I continued studying. And I found that the more I did that, the more I was actually reprogramming my mind. In other words, my theory was that if I used a different path and did something different and stopped using the old path, that eventually the old path would atrophy. And it worked. So
that's a really good idea, because we started a bit of exposition now, beginning of the show. People may not see the relevance of all of that, but we're going to get into that a bit later. But that's why I wanted to bring in that etheric field, which was discredited and is now being found to have some substance again. And being able to switch. What I found interesting to make this point is that a lot of people don't seem to understand it or have experienced it when you actually just are experiencing awareness with nothing there. They're so used to thinking or having thoughts that it's extremely difficult for people to actually do that. And it is the natural state. So we've been taken away from that natural state. And all of this negativity comes in through our interaction with what's going on around us. And that can be from other people's negativity, and most often is. Or it can be from other external factors. But that stillness and the sort of energy that's behind everything, that sort of unified field or field of consciousness, whatever you want to call it, that's always there. And it's not good or bad, but it also interacts with energy centers and in different places. So different places have a high energy. And once you can tune into that, it's all obvious stuff. So when we're talking about this stuff, we often get people going on, oh, the wisdom of the ancients. Well, it's nothing of the sort. It was just living naturally. Just that people are being bombarded with noise and nonsense, and their heads have been filled with rubbish, basically. And all you have to do is get rid of it. I think that's what you're trying to say, really, isn't it?
It is what I'm trying to say, but getting rid of it is easier said than done.
Absolutely. Oh, yes.
And so a person has to get to the point of wanting to change. That's the first step, or realizing that something isn't quite right with the way that they're acting or the way that they're reacting to everything. And so we've got this built-in program that we apparently come in with. I know that I did. I mean, I got programmed from right after I was born. It may have even started in the womb. I don't know, but that's the program. We're all programmed, and our minds are so malleable at that age. We just take everything in as though it's true. So we grow up with that, and we don't know that that's a lie. So, we take in all of the propaganda that's fed to us as truth. We take in all of the things that we see around us as truth, and they're not. Because the people that are giving that to us, they went through the same thing. So they don't know that they're feeding us a pack of lies. So it goes back generations and generations, and I would say it goes back to thousands of years that we've been duped into thinking that we can believe authority because they would never lie. Well, we all know that's not true. We can grow up and spend the rest of our lives thinking, I'm not smart, I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy. All of those things are lies. And
that's actually inbuilt. I mean, that's why we get this totally artificial scenario of competitiveness, which takes us back to this Darwin thing. And it worked for people who believed a certain paradigm. In other words, that they were special, they were going to take charge, and basically natural selection means that I'm cleverer than the rest of them, so I'm going to be in charge. And it's all based on kind of a custodial need to keep everyone in their place. But I think once you see through all that, most of this stuff becomes quite clear. It's just getting to that point, isn't it? And it does take a long time, as you're saying. But I found that I started learning more about meditation techniques, and I don't really use that anymore because you can switch it on and off whenever you want. But it's quite helpful to do that, because with all of the bombardment of nonsense, it's quite difficult for people to still their minds, and tune into stuff. But to me, it's become second nature, really. And yes, this aspect that there's always this negative energy there, I've always wondered about that. And going back to the Nephilim and this idea that they unleashed all these demons, I mean, where did it all come from in the first place? Because when you think about it, that the natural order of things is not like that. So it's like something was put into the field. And that's what interests me, how the field is interrupted. I mean, this may sound a bit abstract to some people, but it's actually quite I'm trying to explain it in an easy way.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing to explain in an easy way, but it can be explained, and I think the simpler we keep it, the better, because there are so many people out there that are, even if they're aware of this, they don't know where to start, because their lives are busy. They're busy going to work. They're busy, worrying about putting food on the table, and their minds are always busy on something else. So they don't take the time to actually sit and think about what's going on in their own mind. And so, but you're right, there is a field around us. It's everywhere. It's in us. It's around us. It's everywhere. Some people call it the etheric field. Some people call it consciousness. People in quantum physics call it, I don't know what they call it, but it's there. I call it the field. And it is, I suppose it is consciousness. It's everywhere. It's in everything. And these entities, I think they're the lower rung entities, as you've stated. They feed off of negative energy. So even if a person is of good spirit and feeling good, if there's some way that the entities can trick them into having anxiety or having negative thoughts of any kind, fear works really well. And so the media pumps out fear porn all the time. And so, if people buy into that stuff and they're afraid that we're going to go to war, they're afraid of famine, and they're afraid of the economy, and they're afraid of being sick, and all of those things, these negative energies thrive on that, because they can just literally suck the negative energy from an individual to the point where the individual, it becomes lethargic, and they don't have any get up and go. They're not enthusiastic about anything anymore. And so that's their food. So they're literally feeding off of us, and it affects people like Jerry's patients. Those are the extreme cases, but it really affects every single one of us. So we have to be able to find a very easy way to eliminate that. So if we're aware of what they are, that's the number one step. Aware that they exist, and then aware that we're not who we are. Let me say this. How can I say this? we're not who they say we are. We're not who our parents said we were. We're not who the church says we are. We were not born in sin, for example. That's a big deal, because people think, oh, we were all born in sin, so we're automatically no good to start with, right?
Well, that's a way of control through the Roman Church. And it's an interesting point you've brought up there, because I've been working on a film, and we put a trailer out about 18 months ago about the execution of heretics and the burnings that happened in London, a place called Smithfield. I've done several shows on it. And what the main purpose of all this was to traumatize the public by burning people in front of them, or hang drawing and quartering them, or chucking them in pots of boiling water, was to traumatize the audience, but also traumatize anybody who thought that they were going to get in the way of a third party, because all of these heretics were burnt because they didn't agree with a third party interloper. They wanted to go directly to the source. And that comes through in all of what it's about. It's about cutting out the middleman. And once you do that, you've cut out the church. So you can't cut out the middleman. They're not going to allow you to do that. But that's an interesting point. I wanted to get to this point about ether, because, as I said, the Victorians really believed all this, and the Victorians were very interested in pushing the boundaries with all this. If you look at it, and the beginnings of parapsychology were in the early 1900s, late 1800s, when we had all this investigations into the paranormal, and of course the ghosts and the table tapping and the seances and all this sort of stuff. And they were very interested in all this. And of course, the elite were starting to move around a lot more and gather all this information from around the world. But this etheric energy, I think, is really important, this etheric field. And I just wanted to say something about it. It comes from the Greek word ether, and it's defined as a hypothetical medium supposed to fill space by means of vibrations in which light and other forms of radiation are transmitted. Up until the latter part of the 19th century, the ether theory was an established scientific fact. Then in 1881, two men named Michelson and Morley carried out an experiment which concluded that there was no Earth motion relative to the ether. Well, to me, that doesn't make sense. That just doesn't make sense, even making that comparison. But we'll get onto that later. This experiment discredited the ether theory and caused its rejection in favour of the theory that space is a vacuum and air is merely a chemical composition of oxygen and nitrogen plus other minor constituency. Well, it is, but the whole of it, and what's behind that? What's behind those elements? There has to be something there, doesn't there? This is my view of it anyway. Yeah, you can't just have all this stuff floating around. If it's in a soup, what's the base of the soup? What's it all about? But it says today there is a return amongst many scientists to some sort of ether theory, whether they call it ether, orgon, quantum sea of energy, 0-point energy, scalar wave fields, or whatever. This is from a website which is called the Center for Implosion Research, and it states, we believe that the ether is for real. That is, it's basically dynamic, vibratory energy. Now, that's exactly how I would describe it. Dynamic, because it is in motion, and this motion always follows a vortex pattern. Now, this is incredibly important, because when you experience this energy, it comes and it's a field, it's constant, but certain places, and there are certain ways that you can increase that energy within your own field. Yes. And that is the key, I think, to protecting yourself against a lot of negativity, is keeping that field going within yourself and being aware at the back of that field that there are things that are out there that can attach themselves to you or get in if your awareness goes, or if you get drunk or you take drugs or you become psychotic or angry. That's when this stuff comes in, like you were saying. It feeds on negativity, and it feeds on when we are unaware. And most people are unaware most of the time. Now, I'm not talking about a daydream state here, because that's not awareness. That's lack of awareness. And what I notice now is that a lot of younger people seem to be in a slightly daydream state. They're not aware of what's going on around them. I see that a lot, and I think it's a lot to do with mobile phone technology and all this distraction. But that, again, is nothing to do with this field of awareness. That's kind of the opposite, really. It's anything where you're wrapped up in thought, or your attention is being taken away from this field, is a distraction from it. And when you actually learn how to do this stuff and get the hang of it, then your concentration becomes better and your recall becomes better, and you're able to stay calmer in certain situations where you would normally find people start panicking, because that's a really interesting thing as well when you get mass panic. And what this sort of awareness does is it kind of removes you from that, because you're not caught up in, you're basically more, it's not like being in control, but it's being in command of the energy, of knowing it's there and knowing what's around you. So I find this stuff really interesting. It says we believe that the ether is for real. It's basically dynamic vibratory energy. Exactly what I thought. But it says scientists such as John Worrell Keely, Nikola Tesla, Victor Schoberger and William Reich have shown that etheric energy, although invisible to most, is very real. It is the stuff that enables the perpetual motion of planets, stars and universes. It is the driving force whereby planets are moved within the flow of ether, similar to logs being moved by the flowing water of a river. This explains why there is no relative motion between Earth and ether. Now, etheric energy moves in a vortex fashion because the vortex provides least resistance to the flowing motion. It follows that physical matter, which is materialized etheric energy, seeks the same low resistance. Motion and water and air have this intrinsic vortex motion. Our blood and the sap of plants move in this way too. After all, our veins, arteries and minute blood vessels are not straight channels. They are winding their way through our bodies, just like a river winds its way through the countryside. Everybody has the ability to see the etheric field that surrounds matter. Everyone has the ability to see the etheric energy field that surrounds matter. That's very, very important. We're born with this natural gift. Unfortunately, we have been brought up to focus only on so-called material objects. Visions of etheric light and colour around people and in nature generally are dismissed as flukes or optical illusions. Now, that's interesting because I was able to do this reading of etheric field and the colours, and all this stuff I think was the natural state, and I think we've been dumbed down, not just through the shepherds and the controllers and what's been around us to distract us, and of course all the negative energy, but I think that it's part of some kind of genetic modification which has gone on with Homo sapiens sapiens, because they do not seem to have true will, and they do not seem to be able to grasp what their controllers are actually doing. In other words, they keep going round and round and round, making the same mistakes all over again, and never actually grasp what is actually really going on. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a big part of it. It may sound a bit abstract, all this, but we're dealing in abstract things, really. It says people can train themselves to regain this ability. Very true. I completely agree with that. The human aura or etheric energy field contains numerous energy centers, also known as chakras. Etheric energy is spiraling into these chakras in a vortex fashion, thereby sustaining the aura. Now, I'm not going to get into chakras. I'm not kind of going off on that tangent at all, but I'm talking about a field of energy, and there are energy centers within the body which can be identified, but I'm talking about the general field of energy, the general energetic field around us, rather than concentrating it in certain areas of the body, even though the crown of the head seems to be a very good way of this energy to come in. You have to be careful with this stuff, because we're not talking about channeling here, are we, Sherry? We're not talking about channeling anything.
No, we're not talking about channeling. What you're talking about is that everything is a frequency. And I wanted to point out that that Michelson experiment, I think the reason that didn't work back then, and it took 100 years or so before we realized that they were accurate in what they were saying. It would be analogous to if you walked outside and wetted your fingertip, right, and held it up to the air, And if there was no wind blowing, then you wouldn't feel anything, right? So you would say, well, there's nothing there. Air is not there. There's nothing there. But if there was a little breeze going, you'd feel a difference, and you'd say, oh yeah, there's something there. So I think that's kind of a simplified way of explaining what they were trying to prove. And they just when they did that, it was under the wrong conditions. So that's why they couldn't prove their case. But they were spot on. I mean, the energy is flowing through us all the time because atoms are moving all the time. They don't stay put. They don't stay in one place. And those atoms that are going through you right now, they've been out in the universe somewhere. They came from, who knows where they came from. They've been everywhere. So all of the atoms have been everywhere, including through us. So this creates a frequency. There's everything is a frequency. Our thoughts are frequencies, our feelings, our emotions. Life itself is a frequency. Our perception is a frequency. And the powers that shouldn't be know these things. They know about this stuff, and they don't want the public to know this stuff. They don't want the public to understand the abilities that we have. And so I think that's why this is such an important topic. If we understand the abilities that we have, then these negative entities that are attacking all the time and sucking our energy out all the time and creating more chaos, so that we'll feel anxiety and we'll feel whatever negative feelings are possible. That's on purpose to keep things going, so they have a constant food source. So the powers that want to be, or the powers that shouldn't be, or the powers that were, is what I like to call them, they know about this stuff. They know about the frequency. And so there's a continuous thing going on to keep us on edge. Well, we can stop that with, it takes a lot of work because we've been programmed all of our lives to think differently, to think the opposite, to prevent us from perceiving the world that is, rather than the world that's being painted right before our eyes.
Oh, yeah, I've got to make that distinction. And that is an interesting point, because that takes us back to what we're trying to say at the beginning of the show, I think, in that the custodians know about this stuff. I mean, it's kind of obvious, really. But I think in this century, we've been the victims of psychology. That psychological warfare has been waged against the public in a very, very detailed way. I mean, the thing I was talking about before, which was basically the church burning heretics in front of large audiences, burning them to death and torturing them, is a way of instilling that fear into people. And what we've got now is a much more subtle version of that, really. It's coming at us from all angles, and it's all about, we have to fight to survive. We're basically material beings, and we have to achieve certain things to look good in our social groups, all the rest of it, and all the rest of it, and all the rest of it. And this is just social engineering. It's quite clever, but it's a real science. And I did refer to that book, the Psychological Society, which came out in the late 70s, I think, which is brilliant because it describes the whole of what's gone on since. And we talk about this week in, week out, with think tanks, agencies of change, and government bodies who are steering the public. They're just steering public opinion all the time. And really, it works. It absolutely works. All of this stuff works brilliantly. You can't say it doesn't.
No, it does work brilliantly. Now, I mean, think about how much we've learned since the early days of mind control, the early MK Ultra experiments and so on like that. We've learned a tremendous amount about the brain, and we've learned about how easy it is to manipulate a group of people. So, yeah, this social engineering is very, very effective. Who was the guy that they call him the king of commercials?
Edward Bernays.
Yes, Edward Bernays. Ever since he put his practice, his information into practice, we've gone by leaps and bounds since then. So
absolutely, I mean, everything's now controlled by PR agencies. So that is the big growth industry, is psychological subversion against the public, and the public will go, that's impossible. I can't be happening on that level. Well, it's happening on every level. Look at every letter from your council. Look at every letter you get through the postman, official organisation. It's all psychology, every little bit of it. And that's a very easy one to see through, really, because once you get into the natural law and truth, then you can actually fire through the whole thing, a bit like what we were talking about at the very beginning of the show with this useful idiot in Walthamstow who has made a big fool of himself and scored a massive own goal, which we shouldn't allow him to forget because he's been paid a lot of money. But these are just useful idiots appointed, and they're there to bring in an agenda. They get their noses in the trough, they get paid well, and they get their egos massaged. But the great thing about it is that they're under a huge deception. So once you cut through it, you can actually bring them down quite successfully. And this, again, is the stuff we talk about. It's all kind of linked, really. But, I mean, we were going to get into a bit more about the Nag Hammadi scriptures. I think we should have a short break now and come back with that, and then get into some of the other stuff we were talking about last night, Sherry, and then go into the That's a Lie program.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay.
Okay, great stuff, everyone. This is Psi Ambience, Cerebral Cortex. We'll be back in 6.5 minutes. Thank you. 2. Hopefully this is going to be a glitch-free second half. Take it away, Mark.
Right. Just before the break, we were talking about etheric energy, and we've been talking generally about energetic frequencies, negativity, entities, all this kind of area, which is often discussed under the banner of parapsychology. But we're talking about science here as well. I'm just going to pick up from where we left off before the break. So what does modern science think about an energy, which we call the ether, which pervades space? Well, apart from the quantum energy that every atom contains, there are atmospheric resonance phenomena that have been investigated called the Schumann waves or resonances. These are very long waves of extremely low frequency, which are present everywhere in the atmosphere of this planet. The Schumann waves have been identified as part of the natural electromagnetic radiation, which is particularly important for life on the planet. The human brain actually resonates with these atmospheric waves. Now, this is really interesting because the Schumann resonance has been rising quite rapidly since the 80s. I think we're from 8 hertz a minute to about 13 now. And there's something interesting about that because the actual magnetic field of the Earth is falling. In other words, the poles are shifting. The North Pole has shifted and continues to move very slowly. However, that doesn't mean that we're going to get an actual pole shift. In other words, the planet turns upside down. But it does mean that it's having an effect. But the Schumann resonance is rising. Now, this, I think, is a lot to do with our interpretation of what is happening in the respect that we think that time is speeding up, and it's not just because we're getting older. Everyone seems to be saying it, and we've talked about this before, haven't we, Tony? But this is all part of the field that we experience. And we're going to go back also now to the beginning of the show when I was talking about the Archons and this interruption of the energy field by these entities. And in other words, historical information that seems to imply that this was the case. In other words, we've got these Nephilim, these watchers came here, interbred with the daughters of men. Basically, they gave birth to giants. They became these warriors called the Rephaim. This is all biblical stuff. And it does seem to have some context. But these watchers, these evil fallen angels, who Enoch was told or had a vision and was taken up in a spaceship, actually, if you read the book of Enoch. And he met these angels, I think it was Michael and Gabriel, and they instructed him what to do with the Nephilim, and they had to bury them in the earth so they could never get out. And they unleashed all these demonic entities, and they were very powerful. Now, we talked about that and way this normal natural field of energy is being interrupted, and the flow of energy is being sort of messed about with, really, by these energies and what's behind that, which is just this etheric field. So if we look at the Nag Hammadi scriptures and also the book of Enoch, let's go into the book of Enoch first, because it says, "But now the giants who are born from the union of the spirits and the flesh shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, because their dwelling shall be upon the earth and inside the earth. Evil spirits have come out of their bodies, because from the day that they were created from the holy ones, they became the watchers. Their first origin is the spiritual foundation. They will become evil upon the earth and shall be called evil spirits. The dwelling of the spiritual beings of heaven is heaven, but the dwellings of the spirits of the earth, which are born upon the earth, is in the earth. The spirits of the giants oppress each other. They will corrupt, fall, be excited, and fall upon the earth and cause sorrow. They eat no food, nor become thirsty, nor find obstacles. And these spirits shall rise up against the children of the people and against the women, because they have proceeded forth from them." Enoch also gives a variation to the origin of demons. This is in the book of Enoch. It implies that demons were already in existence during the time of the fall of the angels. So that's interesting as well. So in other words, they're not saying that these watchers put all these evil spirits on earth, but they just added to them because they were very powerful. Yes, here shall stand in many different appearances the spirits of the angels which have united themselves with women. They have defiled the people and will lead them into error, so that they will offer sacrifices to the demons as unto gods, until the great day of judgment, in which they shall be judged till they are finished. Now let's go into the Nag Hammadi, and we've got Yaldabaoth, and Yaldabaoth said, I am God, and there is no other God beside me. According to the ancient Gnostic text, there's a creator of God named Yaldabaoth, or Ildabaoth, who is described as the child of chaos and was the son of Sophia, which is the earth, and Sophia is wisdom. In Gnostic cosmogenesis, Yaldabaoth is called an angel in the apocryphal Gospel of Judas. He is first mentioned in the cosmic chaos and the underworld as one of the 12 angels to come into being to rule over chaos and the underworld in the Gospel of Nicodemus. Yaldabaoth is called Satan, and Dante called the devil simply a worm. Yaldabaoth boasts that he is God. So this is the fallen angels and the devil. The Archons attack the places where the word first appeared. Well, in the beginning was the word, so they attack from the beginning. The imitator reigns over the earth and leads people astray. Those who follow the imitator will introduce circumcision. Now, this is from the Nag Hammadi scriptures. Souls are purified as apocalypse signs appear. The third age of the spirit is an eon of beauty. Now, this is really interesting, and it's going to take us into the next section. Nag Hammadi, this is from the origins of the world, the creation of humankind. And this is about the creation of us as basically servants and genetically modified slaves. And this is how they describe the creation of Adam. And this is very different from the Old Testament version. It states, if you do not want him to be able to ruin our work, let us create a human out of the earth on the image of our body and with a likeness to this, being to serve us. So we were made in their image. So we look like them, but we're not them. Then it carries on. Then he will fall in love with his likeness. Then he will no longer ruin our work, and we shall make the children of the light our slaves for this entire age. Now that is very interesting, isn't it, Sherry?
Yes, it is, because the children of the light, that's us. And because, we're really not physical beings. We're spiritual beings in these physical bodies. And these physical bodies only animate through consciousness. I mean, you can take a physical body and stick it in a hospital and hook it up with tubes and, technology, and the heart will beat and the blood will flow, but there's no consciousness in that body. So it's like an earth suit, or it's like I don't know what, it'd be like a space suit if we're on another planet and we can't survive in that atmosphere. So that this is a little bit of a sidebar, but that's why, if you think about it that way, of who we actually are as spiritual beings in these bodies for, I don't know, the purpose of becoming more aware, the purpose of growing, the purpose of experiencing third dimension, or I don't know exactly what the purpose is for us being in these bodies. I assume that it's for the purpose of experiencing this particular thing. But if we're the beings of light, and these other entities that are come from wherever they come from, whether they come from this planet, which is hard for me to really believe, because Sophia, or Mother Earth, there's no evil in Mother Earth. There's nature, and that's not evil. That's neither good or bad. It's just there, and it does all that it does through primarily cooperation and not war, which goes back to the Darwinian theory. But yeah, if we're the beings of light and the dark side beings don't want us to ruin their way, of course, we're going to be manipulated through our DNA, we're going to be genetically modified, like it said in the book.
Yeah, that's a really interesting passage, which is obviously, this is not in the Old Testament, this is from the Nag Hammadi scriptures, and it's called From the Wisdom of Jesus Christ. And it states here that he states, I have come from the first, who was sent to reveal to you the one who is from the beginning, because of the arrogance of the chief creator and his angels, for they claim to be gods. I have come to eradicate their blindness, that I might tell everyone about the God who is above all. So in other words, he's trying to state that he's going to bypass this evil energy that's been put in and get to a higher source. That's what he's saying.
Yeah, and the thing is, as I mentioned in our private conversation yesterday, in reading the Bible and looking at what the Old Testament says about God, that God that's in that Old Testament is not the prime creator that created everything. That's that first that Jesus is talking about.
No, he's a controlling psychopathic lunatic called Yahweh.
Yeah. Yes, Yahweh, or whatever the name is. There's a bunch of different names, and people think that that's God. Well, that's not God. That's a being that wants to create chaos. That it's jealous, it's hateful, it's vengeful. It doesn't mind killing off, a whole tribe of people. It just creates chaos. So that's not God. That's not God at all. And people are worshiping a false god. So, that's a big deal on this planet, because so many millions of people worship that guy.
Well, yes, and that is another issue, but we're talking about going straight to the source of energy, really, aren't we? Trying to bypass all this stuff. I think that's the idea.
It is.
But there's some very disturbing passages in that Nag Hammadi, and I pulled them out, and there's a chapter in there called The Rulers of the World Mold Adam, and it says 7 Archons have formed humanity with a body resembling their own body, but the likeness of humankind reflects the human being who appeared to them. And then it goes into the powers rape earthly Eve. So this again is all about this completely negative, invasive energy.
Yes.
And basically the story states that they see Eve and she looks like Adam, and so they rape her so she may not ascend into her light, and her children will then serve us. So this is really quite deeply sinister stuff, isn't it? And it displays to people who read it that there is a malevolent force that these lot were trying to stop or trying to bypass. That's the whole point of these Nag Hammadi scriptures to me, even though many of them are conventional gospels in certain respect. And as a side issue, everyone should read the Gospel of Mary, because it's great. I mean, if we talk about this feminist stuff now and how it's, but that to me should be what women should actually aspire to, because she's saying that, look, I got the information, Jesus gave me this information, and none of the men will believe her. They say, he would never have told you, you're a woman.
I know.
And it's incredible. It's actually really comedic. It's only a short gospel, the Gospel of Mary, but everyone should read it, because it's kind of comedic, because she's saying, he told me, what are you lot on about? He says, why wouldn't he tell me?
Exactly. And in today's age, just to prove a point of just how powerful we really are, have a look at some of the things that they're having to do with us to dumb us down. They have to give us genetically modified foods. They have to give us fluoride in the water. They have to use dangerous electromagnetics in our cell phones, in our cell towers, in our televisions.
Well, this is a different level of it, really, isn't it? But behind all that, there is the level that we're talking about. We're talking about being bombarded with extra frequencies here, but these sort of basic frequencies that we've been talking about are the ones that are being referred to in these scriptures. But yeah, they've upped the game by bombarding us with every frequency possible. That's a kind of complicated area, but yeah, we're going into 5G and all this electromagnetic frequency stuff. We've covered it generally for quite a long time, but
and
it's very important.
We've got the brainwashing of the religious dogma, and that goes back to the books that that they put out. They don't put out the books that they don't want us to read. We've got the Politica dogma, which is, so many people believe that stuff. I mean, there's actually people over here that still think that Hillary Clinton is a saint. I mean, come on. So, and then we've got subtle things that people don't understand, things like collectivism versus individual sovereignty. So.
Oh, exactly. We talk about this every week, Sherry. This is our subject. This is all that we talk about is basically this kind of stuff. But when you're talking about Hillary Clinton, she's definitely an Archon. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that to me either. And so the point I was trying to make that ties in with what we're talking about here on the from the Nag Hammadi library is that this has been going on for such a long time, and now that people are starting to wake up a little bit more, the pressure is on from the Archons to get a hold of this because they're losing the battle.
Well, yes, and let's just give a few more quotes before we go into the final part of the show. This is from the Powers Rape Earthly Eve. States, "Let us put Adam to sleep and suggest to him in his sleep that Eve came from his rib and he may rule over her." What they mean by that is they divide men and women so they're always at war with each other and they rule over the whole lot. That's what they're saying there. It's quite fascinating stuff, and the malevolence behind it is very obvious. But we can even go to the Mayan Popol Vuh, and there's a line in there that says, "Let us make him who shall nourish and sustain us," which takes us back to all that stuff that we've talked about in the past, the Sumerians and all the rest of it. Now, we talked about negative entities, Sherry, and we had a conversation last night about this reptilian agenda and this reptilian energy. And you mentioned this chap called James Bartley. And I looked him up on the internet, and what came up first of all was a friend of mine's website called Whale.2. He's a great archivist called John Scudamore, and he'd archived a lot of stuff about this, and it's just about control, really. And we were talking last night about this sort of reptilian subject, but we were both stating really that we haven't seen much evidence of that as far as these demonic entities go, because the entities I've seen have either been disturbed entities that looked human, or they've been malevolent energies, which I haven't actually been able to identify as anything. We're talking about just malevolent energy fields, but I have seen some of these entities. But I have seen this reptilian thing happen with people's eyes, but only a couple of times. So I was interested to ask you how prevalent you think it is. But first of all, I'm just going to read this. It states from James Bartley, "The reptilians are the controlling factor. One cannot understand why there is constant strife, tragedy and turmoil in the world without first realizing that the human race is under the control and domination of a cruel and remorseless intelligence." I will elaborate on some themes that David Icke brought up. It says here that Draco reptilians are in control. Now, this is where I have a bit of a problem with it, because I've got no evidence that Draco reptilians exist. Now, a lot of people believe this stuff, and I know people who actually believe they're from certain constellations. Now, this could well be the case, but I don't go with it because I can't actually get anything to actually point me in the direction and give me the evidence. This is a problem that I have. Now, we talk about reptilian bloodlines. I think bloodlines have been kept. These people do believe in blood, these people who are ruling, and they do believe that they have certain genetic qualities that we don't, and they're trying to keep those, or they're trying to interbreed with them. But this is just, to me, common sense of survival of these sort of people, because they plan hundreds of years in advance. So I'd just like to get your take on this sort of reptilian aspect of things, Sherry.
Oh, sure. Well, I don't have any personal experience with them, but I don't deny that they exist, because people like James Bartley, who's very credible, have experienced them himself. And so I'm inclined to think, he's not lying. He had that experience, but I can't verify it because it's not within my experience, so there's a difference there. But there's things that are pointing to that maybe, I've heard we have the reptilian brain. That's the first organ that is in the fetus when it's starting to develop. And that's the survival mechanism that we all have. And so whether that relates to that or not, that's being pointed to as evidence. I can't say that it actually is evidence because, I don't have that experience. But
no, I think it's very interesting because, what the R complex is just about reflex and reaction and survival. It's not necessarily good or bad. It just is.
That's right.
But the reptilian thing can be triggered actually to be quite negative, I think, if you're not in control, because people often react violently to situations, or they can have their buttons pushed very easily. But to me, the reptilian, the R complex, is just about the survival and just to make you wake up and be in a situation and react instinctively to things, So I find it quite interesting that the sort of description of these reptilian beings is exactly the same as the 1980s sci-fi series V, when we had these people who landed with very good intentions, and it was in these huge flying saucers that hovered above the earth, and then they all came down and met with the UN, which was quite interesting. If you see the press conference with the visitors, the first people they met were the United Nations. But slowly it's revealed that these human-looking creatures are actually just wearing suits, basically. And underneath it all, they are these reptilians. But when you see these reptilians drawn by people, they are exactly the same ones that were in V. So either the people in V knew something, or people are basing some of this reptilian stuff on V.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a very good point, because if you look back at so much science fiction in the past, and then you look to today, there's an awful lot of science fiction that has become reality.
Oh, absolutely. I love watching films from
I do too.
The 70s and 80s, because they are indicative of what's happening. But of course, we can go back to Huxley and Brave New World and 1984. But some of those B movies, like They Live, that's a perfect analogy of what's going on. Absolutely perfect.
It is, yeah. And I need to watch that movie V. I never did watch it. But I like to watch science fiction, because it's enjoyable. But I also notice that there's an awful lot of it that becomes reality. So did they know, do they just have huge imaginations and then all of a sudden that got manifested? Or did they know ahead of time? And this is the pre-programming that happens to prepare us at some point in the future for what's going to happen in the future. So I don't know the answer to that one, but it's intriguing, very interesting.
Well, it doesn't. It triggers a lot of these sort of ideas within people, if they can remember that far back. I mean, I had a friend of mine, I was talking to about Agenda 21 and what was happening, and she said, it sounds like Logan's Run. And I said, well, it is, yeah. Everyone sort of is basically put down when they're about 35, or becomes no use when they're 35. Yeah, it's interesting stuff.
Well,
I'm getting a bit of an echo on my mic here, Tony. I don't know what it is, whether it's reception or something, but I'm going to let Sherry carry on now.
Okay, well, I was just going to say, in talking about science fiction becoming reality, I read the other day that the fertility rate in humans has dropped substantially. And so, especially here in the United States.
It's plummeted.
And so that instantly reminded me of a Stargate SG-1 episode called The Ashen, where these alien beings came in and they pretended to be nice and they gave us all kinds of technology, and they came up with a vaccination that would be extending life, virtually stopping old age. And that vaccine made all of the population infertile, so that eventually there would be no more population because it would just die out, and then these Ashen would just take over the planet, without any wars or anything like that. So I have to wonder if that's what we're doing, or if that's what's happening.
Yeah, how's that spelled? I will look that up, Sherry.
I think it's ACHEN. It's from Stargate SG-1, which was back in the 80s, I think, wasn't it?
Right, I'll check that out. So
Yeah.
I think I'm coming through your speakers, actually, Sherry. If you can turn are you listening through speakers?
Really?
Yeah, I'm coming through your speakers. You can turn it down a little bit. That would be great.
Okay, hang on.
Okay. Yeah, I can still hear it, but not that loud. So, yeah, tell us about there's a terrible noise coming through. I haven't got a clue what's going on. But carry on.
That was me turning my speaker down. Sorry.
Okay. Sounds like someone twanging a guitar.
Go ahead.
Okay. So tell us about the That's a Lie program.
Yeah, the That's a Lie program is basically understanding that when you're having any kind of anxiety or negative thoughts or anything that is emotionally disturbing, worry, if you're worrying about your finances or you're thinking about something like, I'm not worthy of such a good thing, or I could never do this because I'm not capable, consider that that's a lie. Consider that all of that is a lie. Anything that...
We're talking about these sort of random thoughts that come into people's heads and self-criticism.
Yes, we're talking about self-criticism in general, and everybody's different, so everybody's going to have their own self-criticism. But if you notice that self-criticism is like a broken record, it's playing over and over and over and over again, that's a real good clue that that's coming from somewhere else. It's not coming from you. It's coming from an outside force. And if you want to stop it and you can't stop it, it just keeps playing over and over again. That's a real good clue that that's what that is. So the thing to do right then and there is think, better to say it out loud if you're not in a crowded room, that's a lie. And you may not believe it's a lie at the moment, but if you continue doing it, you'll be actually reprogramming your brain to think that that's a lie. And the other step with that is think of something else. It can be anything else, not even associated with what you've been thinking. For example, if you're thinking, this person hates me and they're talking behind my back. Well, maybe they're talking behind your back, but what do you care? I mean, what difference does it make? It has no reflection on you. It has a reflection on them. But to get rid of that thought isn't that easy. And one way that I found that is pretty effective is to think of something else. Think of something you like. It can be a flower. It can be a baby. It can be swimming. It can be baseball. It can be anything you want. It doesn't have to be associated with that. But the fact is you have to realize that what somebody else thinks of you is a reflection on them. It's not a reflection on you. And if someone is saying, well, you're no good and you're not worthy and you're stupid, and a lot of people grow up being told that they're stupid, they'll never amount to anything, and they believe it. And so these are lies about yourself. And if you can remember that to say that's a lie, and if you can then think about, this thought is not coming from me, it's coming from what someone told me, it's coming from outside of me. And then if you can take it the step further, where you're realizing that this is actually coming from a frequency force, these entities, I call them, that are really wanting you to get into that negative mode so that you can really feel bad about yourself, because that's going to give off the negative frequency, which they take away from you. I call it their food. Maybe it's not their food, but I think that's what it is. They survive off of that.
Oh, so, definitely. And
yeah,
it's very prevalent, and it's actually instilled into us at a very early age. And I remember all that from teachers, parents, and other people. And I was quite astonished to find out that they didn't know what they were talking about. And then I realized that all of this stuff is just opinion. And what people do is they restrict themselves. But we're talking about something slightly different when we get into this sort of psychic attack area, which is a bit more serious, actually, because that can have very destructive consequences, even though it's in a way not as long lasting, because psychic attacks can take a couple of minutes, or you can feel as though they're happening regularly. And these things are being directed at you. And it's very good to know how to deal with it, as we were talking with the energetic field, but also mentally. And that's what I think is great about what you're saying, because you take it to a higher level than just self-criticism, don't you?
Absolutely. I'm realizing that every one of us is a pure, loving being at heart. Whether that heart is covered up with a bunch of mud and muck, and you don't know that, but the truth is we're all loving beings in these bodies. And so the programming that's been laid upon us and all the stuff that's been laid upon us are all lies. And the people that did that to us, they didn't, like you say, they didn't know what they were talking about, but they went through it and they believed it in themselves. And so they pass it on. It's kind of robotic, really, when you think about it. But this is part of the idea that if we can stay in that mode of not feeling good about ourselves and not realizing who we really are and that we are actually loving beings in these bodysuits, then we're going to continue giving out this negative energy. We're going to continue reacting toward one another in a way that's not good. And so you're going to have these energy vampires, these parasites, in other people attacking other people. So I mean, I have seen and experienced where an energy vampire person came into my life, did their. I'm a giving person. I like people, and so I like to help people. Well, when someone comes to me with, in need, I'm happy to try to help him however I can. What I found out is there are some people who will take advantage of that. They'll suck the energy right out of you, and they're influenced by these dark side beings, and they want to inject that into me. And now I know not to do that. I know how to, keep that away. So I don't give them the energy that they want, and I may still help them, but I'm only going to help them to a point. When I start seeing that they want me to be their crutch, that's it. I'm done. I want people to stand on their own 2 feet. So that's an important point when someone's trying to help someone, is you get them to a point where they can carry on, and you notice that they're just not going to do it on their own. They want you to do it for them. And that's the time to pull the plug and just say, no, you have to stand on your own 2 feet. Otherwise you're relying on other people to be your crutch, and that's not a healthy thing to do. So if people misunderstand when I've done that in the past, hopefully they come around one day and realize that that was actually a good thing for them. But yeah, so they're invaded by these beings. They're tricked into being nasty to other people. They suck the energy out of other people, or they inject that bad energy into them if they're open to it. And that's not a good thing. We really need to learn how to recognize that and combat that. You can do it energetically. Because we are energetic beings.
Absolutely. And the energetic field is very, very important to actually be able to tune into that. And of course, the mental processes that you're talking about are on top of that, really. So you've got a defense against all forms of attack, really, if you can start getting to that state. And I did this course several years ago, and they did this program. It's called a consciousness development program. It's just about really attuning yourself, and it was about training you to be able to induce out-of-body experiences. So it was quite intensive in that level. But one of the things that they were doing was experimenting with energy. And what they would do is they would get you to get an energetic field together and strengthen your energetic field. Then they would attack it. And it was absolutely astonishing, because a lot of people would think that's a load of rubbish, and it's not.
No.
It's actually, it's when people can do this stuff, they can do this. And of course, it works in the other way as well. I mean, I've actually had remote healing. Now, people may think, oh, I don't believe in any of this. But just if the field's open, it does work. And I had remote healing from somewhere on the other side of Essex, and I was in North London, and it did work. It worked as though the person was in the room, actually, because I had someone else do some healing on me. I had a very badly broken arm a few years ago, and they just gave me the time when they were going to do it, and I laid down, and it seemed to work. I mean, people probably could not get over this sort of stuff because they've been programmed into not believing it. And everything we see on television, everything that they're doing by getting rid of natural remedies and cutting off our ability to believe it or even actually create and do these things is all part of it, because you don't want the population to be able to heal themselves, to be empowered. They have to be dependent. And all of this stuff really creates dependency. And I think that's the root of the whole thing to get to is, in other words, what you were saying. Yes, you have to do it for yourself. But this kind of constant dependency that people have, I find it quite puzzling in a way, because even friends of mine who I've helped with legal issues, and I've told them how to write a letter, what to say, they still want me to do it for them. And that shows a high level of dependence. But as the cliche says, feel the fear and do it anyway, which is a bit of a kind of, it's new agey sort of positive thinking kind of speak, which I don't really go in for. I think behind things there's a quiet confidence that gets things done. I don't really think all this sort of do it is the way to do it. I think that the sort of the confidence to do things comes from what you've absorbed and your ability to be focused and relaxed, which is what we're talking about really with all this stuff. It's about awareness, and awareness works on lots of different levels. I always found when I was reading a lot of this Buddhist literature that it sounded incredibly complicated, and I could never understand why they had to keep going on and on and on about the same thing. Well, I suppose you've got to keep monks busy, They can only ring bells and chant for a certain amount of time, and they've got to read the rest of the time, or even meditate. So I always found that aspect of Buddhism quite puzzling, really. I read all this Buddhist literature, but I probably went into it far too deeply. And then I realized that the actual key was very simple, but they're actually telling you that in the first place. But of course, you have to keep people on some kind of hamster wheel. So any kind of organized religion is about that. But to be able to cut out the middleman and realize this stuff, I think, is the most important thing. I wanted to just finish up there, Sherry, with what you think.
Yeah, well, the way to change your mind is by repetition. The way to learn something new is by repetition. For example, if you want to learn how to play the guitar or the piano, you don't just sit down and play it instantly. You have to practice, and you have to keep doing it over and over again until everything becomes automatic, until you automatically know where everything is. It's the same. That's the way the brain works. So if we want to change what's firing by one synaptic path, into firing another synaptic path, we have to repeat it over and over and over again, because the primary synaptic path that's been doing it for 10 or 15 or 20 or 40 years, it's an automatic thing. So you want to change that. It's a hard thing to do. You have to keep repeating over and over again and purposely not using that other path, even though it wants to go, it wants to fire. And a lot of times it will fire. You have to stop it right then and there, and use create a new synaptic path, as it were, until that one becomes the new habit or the new path. It's an automatic path. So in the idea that I think comes across when they're saying, fake it till you make it, just keep on doing it. There's a belief system in there too. If you believe that that's going to work, well, then it will. But if you don't, then it won't. So that's just how powerful we are. So, whether we're right or wrong, if we think we're right, then if we think we're wrong, then we are. I mean, if we think something's not going to work, then it won't. So that's part of the situation that we're faced with, is people who are, for example, wanting to always have you do everything for them. Well, I don't know. Maybe they were. Maybe it was ingrained in their mind that they're not capable, that they'll never be able to do anything new, and so that's the part that needs to change. And
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and so that's what I do with people, is when I see that that's going on. I mean, I don't just cut them off and say, okay, you're done. I'm finished with you. I try to get them to see that they've been programmed to have no confidence in themselves. They've been programmed to fear doing something new. And most people on this planet are afraid of the unknown.
Oh, absolutely. That's a great point, because that is the thing that keeps people in a very, very small area of consciousness and thinking and habit. I mean, in actual fact, habit forming can be quite good, but not to the extent that people do it. It just becomes an actual cycle, a cycle of their life, which they can't break. And of course, that's all part of the drone mentality. That's all part of what we've been talking about. That's all part of being controlled by an external force. It's all that sort of external control, because these superior beings, or people who are manipulating us, know this stuff. I mean, it's obvious, really. In fact, I think that it's been kept away from us because obviously we need a custodian. It's been proven, and the custodians have taken it upon themselves to do what they think is best for us. And if that means reducing the population, making us infertile, killing us off early, then they'll do it. I mean, it makes sense when you think about it, because if they think they are the rightful rulers and custodians of this planet, which has been terraformed in a certain way, I believe, to actually be looked over, because it's in this thing called the Goldilocks zone, which is this perfect place. If you look at the position of the planets from this planet, the sun and the moon, and the anomalies there, which mean that there is some kind of absolute intelligent design going on. We don't need to go into that. We've only got 5 minutes, but all this stuff is very important, I think. Yeah. Oh, we can go into it some other time, but I think it makes absolute sense that there's a background canvas for everything, which is what we've been talking about, which is a field of ether or etheric energy, a field of awareness, which can be tuned into and can be realized at any time. And it's a blank canvas on which everything is painted and all energy flows from it. And the interruption of this field is only on a surface level. But there are energies or entities that can manipulate it when minds are distracted, which with most people is most of the time. Would you just like to come in again there, Sherry, to wrap up?
Yeah. Most people are distracted most of the time. Most people live unconsciously most of the time. And that's because about 95% of the time they are unconscious. They're able to function, but they're not thinking about what they're doing. They're just doing. So that's a big point. Another point I wanted to point out in our last minutes is that there are an awful lot of people who think that just looking at something new, just considering some new concept is going to hurt them. And it's hearing something new, reading something new, considering it doesn't hurt. You're just considering it. That's a mind program that we've been fed that, don't look at that, it'll hurt you. And that's wrong. That's a lie.
Absolutely is. Can you give us your blog and your website, Sherry?
Yeah, my website is www.keyholejourney.com. And on the website, there's a menu link that says blog, and that'll take you right straight to my blog. There's also links there for Jerry Marzinski's work, There's links there for my Facebook and my YouTube channel. So, yeah, that's the primary link. It's keyholejourney.com.
Well, that's great. And of course, I got in touch with you through Jerry, and we did a very, very interesting, fascinating, in fact, interview with Jerry called Are Demons Real? It's about demonic possession, and it ties into what we've been talking about. We've gone into a bit of a broader field with it to try and open it out and bring in other areas. And I think it's been very interesting tonight, and I hope the people have enjoyed it. We've got quite a few minutes left, so that's all right. We can wrap up. And I'd just like to go into the whole picture of like what's called the New Age, because I think there's a lot of deception in there. And what we're trying to talk about here is to get back to the core of what things are really about, because I think the deception of a lot of this stuff has led people into things like channeling, and channeling what? Channeling entities. Mm-hmm. So I've got a bit of a problem with that, only because of my own personal experience. Not I've channeled things, but I know people around me have, and it's not been very positive for them. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't know anybody personally who does channeling, but I have watched and listened to a lot of people who are channeling this one and that one. I can't name their names right off the bat, but there's a lot of them that, well, here's one that I'm thinking about is the woman who did the Seth books.
Yes.
Jane, I can't think of her name right now, but anyway, yeah, if you ever watched her during her sessions, she turned from a regular person into a really demonic-looking facial person. So that was very disturbing. So yeah, I think it's interesting, but I think it's dangerous. And how do you know who's coming through?
That's my entire point. That's it in one, Sherry. You don't. And that's the thing about it. Because I've seen people under the influence of this stuff, and I've actually had psychic attacks from people who've been channeling around me. So I know this stuff is dangerous, and it's not all love and light. And that's the whole point of this show, in a way, when we talk about the Archon energy, which has been kind of overused, I think. But we're talking about entities, we're talking about energy fields. And I think that when people just open themselves up, that's exactly what we're telling them not to do, in a way, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And I mean, I wouldn't recommend it at all. But, that's just because of my own experiences with the dark side. And I know that the dark side, even in the scriptures, you can see that they can come in as a bright, shiny angel, or be whoever they get into your mind and into your belief system. And so they know how to present to you as somebody that you revere. And so how do you know? Well, the only way I think a person could know is through their frequency. And if you're not aware of your frequency, and you're not even aware that there are frequencies, you're in trouble. You're in potential trouble. So
yes, an interesting one. That's often presented like that, and in real life, in material life, it's presented like that as well. So in other words, you get somebody who's too good to be true, and they're always a wrong un. It's like I say to people who've come into this sort of alternative media, I spotted loads of them years ago, and I got a lot of flack for it at the time, but everyone said, "Oh, you were right, how did you know that?" I said, well, it's clear when someone comes in with a lot of attention, and they're getting popular very, very quickly, and they're leading a lot of people. Always be wary of that, because this was the cult of the guru, and we know what a lot of those people are. A lot of those people from India who people revered were absolute charlatans, and we've covered this with this documentary. It was made in the 80s, actually. It really is interesting, because it goes into how Robert Mueller of the UN Secretary General, was co-opting the New Age movement into this global governance. Very, very clever. And of course, all these groups, one of which I know very well, was coerced into having seats at the UN, and you meet all the great wise people, and they talk the same rubbish as each other. In other words, infinite consciousness and vague terms, and basically acquiescence from any responsibility in daily life. And that, when you see that in action, and you see people sitting round in absolute squalor and going, yes, but I'm in another dimension, then that to me is not taking care of business. We're talking about something slightly different, I think.
Well, not really, because I think anyone who is preaching or teaching that anything other than you need to get in touch with your own self, you need to understand your own inside. The information is within you. It's always been within you. You just need to look. You need to be a sovereign individual. Anyone who's preaching anything other than that, stay away from.
I absolutely agree. And something else we were talking about, I was talking about heretics, and heretic just means someone who is able to choose. So that's an interesting interpretation there, because when people go, oh, heresy, it's something that's against the state. But the reason it's against the state is because it's somebody who's thought things through. So in other words, anybody who gets accused of heresy is someone who can think for themselves. Mm-hmm. And the group mind consciousness thing of the New Age, which is like a hive mind, is to trap people into collectivism, but under the banner of a cruel and controlling and egotistical guru, a bit like a Yahweh type character, because that's what all these characters are like when it comes down to it. I've never met any of these people who've been kind and compassionate when it came down to it. I've always been extremely disappointed, and I've filmed a lot of them over the years. Mm-hmm. I've done interviews with a lot of them, and I've looked at it afterwards and gone, well, I was expecting something profound, and I got this. Uh-huh. I mean, it's just kind of vague waffle, and that's something I really don't like.
Yeah, it's another means of control. It's another means of generating or generating learned helplessness. And if we continue to be helpless, then that's what religious dogma is. You know, be helpless and fear God. Don't think that you're the one that should be contacting God one-on-one. I mean, that's heresy, right? You got to have a middleman. Yeah, so that's a bunch of lies, and that's for the purpose of control. It's the same thing with the New Age, the development of the New Age. Like many things, they start out okay with a good idea, and then they get infiltrated by the CIA or some other alphabet agency that wants to make sure they get a handle on that, because they can't have people waking up. This is why it's an individual
that's the whole point. And people really love to think that they're in control of their lives. And the people who think they're in control of everything are the most self-satisfied, are actually the most controlled. And that's obviously the kind of wisdom of a lot of this stuff, really. It's about saying that, you know. Basically, people who think they know a lot usually know nothing. As I've learned more and more, I feel like I know very little. But when I'm in the presence of a lot of these people, these New Age people, I realize how childlike their minds are. You know, it's like a form of regression, really. So we're talking about, sovereignty is really important. And I love that word sovereignty. It's extremely important, because what we need to be is sovereign. Now, we can act collectively, but we need to be able to think for ourselves. And discrimination with all this is very important. But discrimination actually comes from this awareness, from developing that sort of awareness. And I think that is the key to it. It has been for me anyway. What do you think about that, Sherry? Yeah,
I do too. I mean, sovereignty, individual sovereignty is crucial for the freedom of the people, for the freedom of this planet. We can, like you say, we can act. I wouldn't say we act in collectivism, but we can act
collectively. Collectivism's a term which is
okay. So
off what we were talking about, and absolutely.
Okay. We act
people
collectively.
Are brainwashed into that,
and we act cooperatively, and then we get an awful lot done. The answer obviously is obvious to me anyway, and to you, I'm sure, and a lot of the listeners, is that, what we're doing today, the wars and the pollution and the killing and the trickery and the propaganda and all of that stuff, that's not the answer. That's not the answer to anything. So But what is the answer is if an individual gets to the point of really wanting to be sovereign, they have to work at it, and they have a lot to go against because we've allowed this system. We didn't develop it ourselves, but we've allowed this system to be in place that exists today. So, it's time for more people to wake up. There's an awful lot of people who are waking up or who are awake, and that's wonderful. It's very powerful.
I'll just finish off with a quote from Charles Fort, and he said, "The earth is a farm. We are someone else's property. And once we learn that we have been classed as property, then we can learn not to be property."
Exactly. That's well said.
Well, thanks very much, Sherry. Just remind us of your website again, just before we leave.
KeyholeJourney, all one word, .com.
That's great. Okay, Tony. Well, it's back to you then, and thanks for listening, everybody. Go to windowsontheworld.net. We're trying to broadcast on different platforms here. We've had a few technical problems, but that's because it's live, and we do like it like that. It keeps us on our toes, even though it might be a bit traumatic at the time when you're thinking, oh, we're on air, and then you go, oh, we're not. Well, we're on air now, and we'll be on air next week. So thanks to everybody for listening. Thanks very much, Sherry Swiney, for coming on Windows on the World. We'll do this again. There's a lot of things we can go into. And say hello to Jerry. I will speak to you very soon. And over to you, Tony.
Thanks, Sherry. Thanks, Mark. Interesting show. I've enjoyed it. Hopefully we'll get all the technical stuff sorted for next week. And we might even get onto Facebook. You never know. We look forward to that. Anyway, cheers, everyone. Thanks for everyone in the chat. Excellent comments. Good conversation. We'll see you next week. Have a good one. Reversal of the poles.